I want to begin with something that John said. The phrase was, if only my life was like them. And that really is the heart of chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians. I think many of us live our lives as what I call sort of looking over your shoulder Christians. And I guess you know what I mean, or have lived like this at least at some point. I look over my shoulder at someone else and I say, well, I would be a great Christian if I had their life. Be a good Christian if my health was better, if I had different neighbors, different flatmates. Sorry if you're here as flatmates. There's something in my life that holds me back as a Christian. I just need to fix that. Maybe even I just need God to fix that. Well, and then I would really get going as a Christian. And in chapter 7, we cover an enormous amount of ground. There's status, race, job, and then there is a wide range of relationship status: single, married, divorced, widowed, engaged, or married to someone who is not a Christian. In Corinth, it seems that right across that range, you had people who wished they could be someone else. I'd be a good Christian if I was Jewish. I'd be a good Christian if I was single. I'll be a good Christian once I get married, when that happens. And I don't think this will be a 2,000-year-old issue for people here tonight. In our culture, well, we still put huge weight on status and race and job. And our relationship status has got kind of confused with our very humanity itself, hasn't it? As if marriage was, well, what some might say the end of your individual life, the end of you. Or as if marriage, other people might say, was the beginning of the real you, the beginning of your real life. Congratulations, your life can begin now. Or as if sex itself, or having sex with at least one person once, that was how you validate yourself as really a human being at all. So Paul has something startling and radical, but simple, I think, to say. And we'll see next week that he means it, even in really, really hard circumstances. And what he says is, why not be a good Christian where you are now? Rather than looking over your shoulder at the things you want to fix, why not start now and serve God where you are, serve God here? In fact, just like that final question in the interview, he wants them to see what is good about every circumstance. God is good, God gives us good things. Could that really include all of the things talked about in this chapter? Could that be a gift from God? Could God really intend for me to live for him here? So page 1148, look down at chapter 7, verse 1, where Paul is asked a question about sex, but goes on to give an answer about all of life, the meaning of life. 7 verse 1, now about the matters you wrote about. So we flipped things. Paul is now answering their questions. And the first one is about marriage, even though the translation says a man and a woman. The answer, everything about the chapter assumes this isn't about a generic man or woman. It's about a man and a woman who are married to each other. And they think it would be good if they didn't have sex. It is good for a man, husband, not to have sexual relations with a woman, wife. And we're going to talk a bit about how marriages can get difficult, or how sex within marriage can be difficult. But the issue here is religious. They think they would be better Christians, more holy, more spiritual, if they put all of that sort of messy, animal, bodily sex stuff behind them. And you can see that, I think, in verse 5, verse 6, Paul's concession is about finding enough time for them to pray. That's what they say this is all about, prayer. And in the parallel case in verses 12 to 16, he says, don't worry, you and your children, they are sanctified. They are holy. Your marriage status, it's not cutting you off from God's. So they're thinking that they would be better Christians if they could be single again, or at least if they could live like single people, while still sharing the roof and the mortgage. And Paul's advice is stop looking over your shoulder, be a good Christian where you are. And it flows directly out of what we were looking at last week. Last week we talked about sex. We said sex is for a good purpose. God invented sex. God thinks sex is good. Your body belongs to Jesus. And in 6 verse 20, we are commanded to honor God with our bodies. And the very first example is what we've just had read by John. Very first example is have sex with your spouse. And we said last week, isn't that a shock? If you're used to every Christian message about sex being don't or careful. So the general advice is for married people, they're in focus tonight, and it is live here. Live where you are. And we're going to say in general, be married, i.e. have sex, and stay married. Is what we're going to say. But before we work through the verses, and I'm going to have some headings for us, there are 3 words here that I just want to show you in verse 5. And I want to show them to you first so that we can avoid what have been repeated and horrific misapplications of this passage. And in verse 5, the 3 words are by mutual consent. By mutual consent. And those are remarkable words given the culture of the time, given what the pagan world thought about male power and its rightness, and actually what they thought about power in general, and what it meant for the rightness of sexual demands on the weak. These are remarkable words, by mutual consent. And everything we're going to say tonight assumes that consent is essential. These verses, they are a series of invitations for people to behave a certain way, including to offer themselves sexually to their spouse in marriage. But these verses, they are not any kind of invitation for someone to take something without consent. So similarly, when we come to, that's be married, but when we come to say point 3, stay married, that is not saying that anybody should stay in a situation where they are not safe or where anything is being taken from them without their consent. And this was driven home to me forcefully this week when I read a victim statement by a victim of abuse and recognized 1 Corinthians 6, but as a quote from their abuser. So I want to read you just a bit of that statement. One of his big claims was that our bodies weren't ours, but God's. Well, that is what 1 Corinthians 6 says. So he said it was about using one's body for godly ways. Well, that also is what 1 Corinthians 6 says. But then the statement went on, godly ways, which were whatever he happened to declare them to be, supported by Bible verses. So just before we work through today's verses, I want you to know how these verses must not be used. I am hoping that there will be conversations about sex between spouses taking place all across London because of what we're looking at tonight. I'm hoping there will be frank and embarrassing and loving and kind conversations about sex and about whether there has been too little sex and whether there should be more sex. And I'm very sorry if you're visiting as a married couple and you had no idea what you were coming to tonight. But these verses, they must not be used to put pressure on someone to do anything sexual that she or he does not want to do. Marital rape is still rape. And marital rape that uses Bible verses as a means of control is a terrible, evil thing to do to somebody. And I hope just even covering that ground just highlights that even though I think Paul just has 3 quite simple things to say to us, some of them will touch on deeply painful and personal areas of life. And that is simply because sex and relationships, they're not just appetites, as we've been saying. They're tightly bound into who we are as human beings with bodies. And because sex is the good but powerful, purposeful, uniting glue of the Creator God. So we feel this very deeply, and the scope for getting this wrong is very deep. Okay, 3 points. First one is the longest by far. It says, married people, be married. Okay, that's verses 1 to 5. Married people, be married. And they are saying it would be good if they didn't have sex. And I think that's based in their idea that bodies are unspiritual and the spiritual bit of you is better. And even though that Greek idea has kind of faded over time, we have well over 1,000 years of church history that also has peddled the idea that the holiest people are the ones who swear vows of chastity and go and live in monasteries and convents. And though that is rarer now, that is still going and it still happens. And I suspect the sort of underlying look over your shoulder thing is universal, whatever you were brought up to think about monks and nuns. Because most marriages throw up opportunities every day to think, wouldn't life be easier without this man or this woman? And that's almost the point of marriage, isn't it? It is about the mutual sharing of life with another human being who, like the first human being in that arrangement, is not perfect all the time and in fact is selfish some of the time. But the goal is still each to give up their life for the other. After 20 years of married life, Claire and I have recently come to the conclusion that we are not capable of sharing one toolkit. I'm not going to tell you any of the whys or the hows of that particular decision, but we've just decided it is well worth the cost of buying a second set of screwdrivers and hammers. That is just a cheap way of avoiding some arguments we didn't need to be having. And I say that without thinking that is in any way unusual. And our particular solution may be unusual, but and in a Christian marriage, you can attach a God excuse, can't you, to any human difficulties between you. Until we kid ourselves that, if only we weren't married, well, we'd never argue with anyone, would we? We would volunteer to serve with every waking hour of our life, and we would be spending hours of every day reading the Bible and praying, just like all of the single people here tonight. And we forget so quickly. And when marriages are difficult in any way, sex is one of the first areas where the problems are seen. And this is an area where we really need to hear from each other and where younger Christians need to listen to older Christians who are willing to be honest. And please hear me rightly, you can be honest without being detailed. You can be honest without discussing things that your spouse would much rather were not discussed. Claire has seen a copy of everything I'm planning to say tonight. So let me give some examples. I've often found myself talking about marriage with single people who wanted to be married. I can remember one conversation in particular with a group of same-sex attracted Christians. And we were talking about the real hardship involved for them in saying that sex is only for a heterosexual marriage, which 2 weeks ago we were talking about as the Bible's position. And that is a real hardship for the same-sex attracted Christian. But as my friends spoke about marriage, they said things like this. They said, you see, to be married, you'd never be lonely again. And you would always to have someone who would listen to you, talk about how your day had gone, and sympathize with you, someone to care about you and be kind to you, someone to be your friend and share everything about themselves with you. And without needing to give them any sense, that Claire and I had any particular abnormal problems that you need to be worried about, I was able to tell them that marriage is not always like that. There are married, lonely people. There are married people who are not kind and sympathetic to each other. There are married people who find it needs regular and difficult work to maintain a friendship and be friends to each other. Another time I remember very clearly is I was preaching on this passage over a decade ago at a new church. It was a new church plant. And as I was speaking, sometimes you can just tell as you're speaking that everyone in the room thinks you're an idiot. You're being very polite at the moment, that is what you're thinking. But I could tell I'd lost them completely. And it wasn't until afterwards, as I was cycling away from the church, that I realized what the problem was. I was saying, broadly, married people should have sex with each other. And it occurred to me as I cycled away that night I was the only married person in the room. Everybody else, it was a very new church, mainly of young people, everybody else was in the dating phase of London life. So a huge number of people there were spending all of their spiritual energy desperately trying not to have sex with the person that they were dating. And the very idea that once you were married, someone would need to tell you to have sex, they just could not conceive of a world like that. But Paul knows what he's talking about, and he gives some reasons in these verses, and he also lays out a very clear balance of priorities in a married life. So let me run through some of that quite quickly. Verse 2, verse 5 talks about sexual immorality or the temptation of Satan. See, these Corinthians, they thought they could just turn their bodies off and then be kind of super holy Christians. Sorry. But sexuality is just designed into our bodies, and the God-given place for sexual activity is marriage. So to try and live married in a relationship designed to be sexual, but without sex, is an invitation for temptation, for Satan to tempt one or both of the spouses to unfaithfulness. And notice the goal he recommends, the kind of goal he's aiming at when he says marry people instead of that, why not have sex with each other? The goal is to avoid sexual immorality. And it doesn't say anything goes as long as your spouse is in the room. So there is such a thing as sinful sex with your spouse, or lustful thoughts during sex with your spouse. It's extraordinary to me that secular agony aunt, sex experts apparently, talk about pornography as if it will help your relationship. Paul says no, he is recommending loving, mutual, exclusive, God-honoring, self-giving sex as the alternative to sexual immorality. Then he explains that mutual self-giving of marriage using extraordinary language, challenging language. So verse 3 is about duty, verse 4 is about authority, and verse 5 says deprive. And notice that the gender balance is absolute here. So verse 4 says something true about the wife. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. Then says, in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Very helpful, I think, in their culture. That would have been extraordinary. And even in ours, the jokes about marriage and sex, they normally assume that it's always the husband who wants to have sex more and the wife who wants to have sex less, but the reality can be either way round. And the reality is that whichever way round, particularly in English embarrassment culture, having a conversation about sex within marriage is difficult and can be deeply emotionally painful. But every Hollywood film and every magazine with articles offering to fix your sex life, they all assume actually the answer is more selfishness. The goal of sex is your body and to give your body the most amazing experience possible. Whereas Paul invites both spouses to see their bodies as a gift to the other person. And then the balance of priorities bit comes in verse 5. This is what Paul calls a concession. Verse 6, he says, there is one situation where you might agree not to have sex. It's only for a time, and it is only so that you can devote yourself to prayer. Again, I wonder how often prayer, too much prayer, has been the danger compared to too much career or too much Netflix or any number of far more boring and less interesting things. And I think this illustrates again how helpful it is to have a range of Christians to speak to, different ages, different experiences. Why it was so valuable to have John sharing tonight. Because actually, as life situations change, sex becomes more or less difficult. So that new marriages actually often find sex very difficult, whereas Hollywood and the wedding industry says it should be easy and best when you're young. Health, as health changes, gets worse. Pregnancy, the monumental exhaustion of having young children, those things all make a difference, as does what our culture shouts about the undesirability of old bodies or different bodies. Paul says this is about self-giving, and he encourages married people to be married Stay where you are. Be a Christian where you are. Sex between husband and wife is a way to honor God with your bodies. Well, second, we're going to come to verses 7 to 9. And 7 to 9 is really been the theme of the service tonight. This is about learning to see the gift. Learn to see the gift, verses 7 to 9. And in 2 weeks' time, Paul will be speaking mainly to single people. And here he just gives single people one verse, verse 7. He says, I wish that all of you were as I am. And he means single, like him. Paul, the author, is a single man as he writes. He says, I wish that all of you were as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. And it's clear and not controversial to say that he is talking there about marriage and singleness. He thinks there is a gift of marriage and a gift of singleness. And again, John helped us a lot with thinking about some of the benefits and advantages. What is contested, and I just want to talk about for a few minutes, is quite what he means by the gift. See, I've frequently come across Christians who think this is about some Christians being better suited to one or other relationship status. That is how we sometimes use the word gift, isn't it? So he has a real gift for singleness, or he is really good at being married. And in its full form, you say that there are just some people who are suitable for singleness. In the Catholic version, it's about a strong call to celibacy. In the evangelical version, it seems to be more about a suggestion that some people just don't feel sexual attraction very strongly. And actually, it turns into an advice that nearly everyone should work hard at getting married as soon as they can, unless you are one of these people who doesn't really feel sexual. Well, then marriage isn't for you. You have the gift for singleness. And actually, verse 8 and 9 get taken that way as well. So look down at verse 8 and 9. So verse 8, okay, Paul does say unmarried people would be good to stay as they are, and that is consistent with his general advice through the rest of the chapter to single people and about life in general. But then he says, verse 9, says, if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Which can give you just a very simple diagnostic, can't it? Do you burn with passion? Well, if you do, get married, straightforward. And it contributes to the pressure in the church, more broadly, to say yes to every single kind of sexual relationship. And that would be on the grounds that this would just be very unfair of God otherwise. Unfair to allow some people to feel sexual, but not give them a place where it was legitimate to express that. But in fact, the words with passion, those words are not really there at all. That is our translator trying to help us understand what the translator thinks it means. Nor is it clear how far the loss of control has gone. In fact, I don't think these verses are about someone and how passionate they feel and their desires. This is about an unmarried couple who could get married, but haven't yet, but are already in a sexually intimate relationship. They are now not controlling themselves. And Paul says, well, it would, rather than stay there, it would be better to get married than to continue a sin that will burn you. And he might mean hurt you because of the way that sex is so profound in who we are. But he could also mean hurt you eternally, given what he said in chapter 6 earlier. Not that that's saying you must marry the person. Other options are available. It would be possible to stop having sex and change your living arrangements and your patterns of relating and begin then the hard work of deciding whether you want the commitment together that God says is the only right place for sex. But you see, there's nothing in verse 9 that overturns the general statements in the whole chapter and in verse 7 and verse 8. The gift is not about the person, as if some people never burn with passion. And the gift relates to the relationship status itself. So each person has their own gift. There is no category of giftless, unavoidably unhappy person, Christian, stuck in the wrong situation for their special ability. Do you see how that would follow? if we're saying this is about a special ability, if you say the gift is unique to the person, then most people with the marriage gift spend years of their life in the wrong situation. We all spend years single, and then most of us, nearly all of us, spend years single, but wondering if anyone will want to marry us. And even then, as John was saying, a story that was not exceptional, and that was the point. It is a very weird modern myth that once you get married, singleness will never return again. And when Paul wrote, the reality was that widowers and widows were everywhere. And everyone knew that marriage was just for a time. And the special ability view means that as well as all the normal things about maybe wanting to be married, you can actually spend all of your spiritual energies thinking that God has given you the wrong situation for you and blaming God. Whereas Paul instead wants to say, really, there is no wrong situation for you. You may or may not be happy with everything about where you are. You are free to change where you are. We'll see that next week. He's not opposed to changing your situation. But you can be a Christian here, where you are. You're not in the wrong place for the gift God has given you. And I'd love you to write down just 2 other Bible verses. And I just want, and I'm happy to have questions on this next week, but to say there's nothing here that conflicts with what is elsewhere in the Bible. So in 1 Timothy 4, verse 1 to 5, there is a strong warning not to forbid marriage in general. That's not what Paul's doing here. He's saying singleness is good, it's a gift, but you may get married. Nor is what he's saying in conflict with Genesis 2. Genesis 2, verse 18, describes Adam's situation as not good. It is not good for man to be alone. But Adam, when you think about his situation, he was the only human being on planet Earth with a very particular God-given task. The task he'd been given was, among other things, the task of filling the earth with babies. So there are some very particular reasons why aloneness is a problem for Adam. And marriage in Genesis 2 is the wonderful good that answers that need. But that is not to say that the modern Hollywood myth of marriage is about 2 people on their own being kind of perfect while the rest of the world is away from them. Actually, that's not the Bible's total answer to aloneness. Again, John talked about church family, about you. You might be the Genesis 2:18 answer for each other rather than a marriage. So, Paul thinks that if you're here and you're married tonight, remember that's the problem he's got, people who wish they weren't married. He says you should see that marriage as a gift from a good God and thank him for it. And we'll see more in 2 weeks' time, but he does also think that if you are single tonight, you can see that singleness as a gift from a good God and thank him for it. And I'm grateful to John for some of what he said about the not idolizing either state, but also the starter he gave us on what can be good about marriage. But again, remember what I said at the beginning, 3 simple things, but there is huge pain and difficulty in each of them, depending on our situation. But you see, the way out of looking over your shoulder, Christianity, is looking at God, Christianity. Is God good? Does he know the battles and the sorrows of the place where I live? Can I look for ways to thank him about what is uniquely good about where I am now? And there is an asymmetry, isn't there, between marriage and singleness, because the married person is called, we'll see this in a second, called to see their choice as permanent, lifelong in intention. They don't have the choice to say, I decide tomorrow not to be married. But the single person is free to make choices, free to choose to stay single, free to choose to be married. But there is no asymmetry in attitude. Even if you are to go on looking for someone to marry, even if you were planning to come and ask me to take your wedding tonight, as I may say, actually, almost every time I've ever spoken on this subject, there is a couple in the room who were planning to come and tell me they're engaged and tell me they're planning to get married, and would I take it? If you're here, you can join the queue of people wanting to ask that. Even if you're in that situation, you can still see the singleness you have now, for however many months left, as a good gift. Okay, final thing, time's nearly gone, but finally he talks to married people and he says, stay married, verses 8 to 16. And these are verses about the very particular difficult situation of a marriage where one of the partners has become a Christian. So two people who are not Christians who've got married, and then one has become a Christian. And most of us will know people in that situation, and it can lead to very significant mistreatment of the new Christian for their choice of Jesus. And there are people here in this church who have lived through that. But these verses, they address the situation where the non-Christian spouse is willing to stay married, but the Christian is worried that somehow they'll be spiritually held back. They won't reach their full potential as a spiritual, holy Christian while they're living with someone who doesn't understand. And again, Paul repeats the general advice. He says, be a Christian where you are. The work of making you holy, it has been done powerfully enough by God that it even, verse 14, somehow extends to the spouse. And certainly it extends to the children. Those children, they are members of the covenant community with no spiritual disadvantage to them. So what Paul's saying here, it doesn't make any difference at all to the difficulty, I don't know, Sunday morning. Shall I take the children to church this morning? Do you have to? It doesn't make any difference to the, is the time for me to go to Bible study every week on a Tuesday evening when your spouse thinks you're mad? Where is my person I married gone since you became a Christian? But there is a total change about that sort of spiritual anxiety. God did not make a mistake. You became a Christian, you trusted in him, you are holy and justified, sanctified, washed, the language we used in chapter 6. And the non-Christian status of your spouse makes no difference to that. And verse 15, verse 16, maybe the non-Christian will leave. And sadly that does happen. But if not, verse 16, same advice. Stay where you are and pray for their conversion. It may be someone in that situation can't be showing up to help and be a partner in all the same ways and be at Bible study in all the same ways as someone where there's two Christians in the marriage. But here is someone who might become a Christian through you. Here is something to do, to pray, to love them, to be married to them. That is part of being a good Christian where you are. Don't look over your shoulder, look at Jesus. Thank him for the gift of where you are and serve him and honor him where you are. There's much more we could say, and that's why question time is next week, or please come and talk to me, or I would strongly recommend talk to someone who looks like they might have a different experience of life from yours. And let's be good Christian brothers and sisters to each other tonight. I'm going to pray and then hand back over. Our Father, we thank you that you are a good God and that you show us this in the death of your Son, his incredible love for us. And so we ask, Father, you would be with us, you'd help us where, whatever it is about our life, whether it's what we've talked about tonight or any number of other things where we just wish it was different. Help us, Father, to live for you where you have placed us, to trust you, to serve you, to thank you for what is good, and to press on to be devoted to you more and more in the life you have given us. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.